The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Meadows, and I'm the Director of the Division of Energy Assistance with the Office of Community Services in the Administration for Children and Families. On behalf of the division, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on completing the Federal Fiscal Year 2024 Grantee Survey, which is Module 1 of the FY24 Performance Data Form. Today's webinar is being conducted by Apprise, and we have two presenters from the Apprise team today. Melissa Torgerson of Verve Associates is the former LIHEAP coordinator for Oregon, and she works regularly to assist grant recipients with in-depth technical assistance. Dan Bouch from Apprise has more than 10 years of experience conducting LIHEAP report training and review. Next slide, please. Today's webinar will focus on key items needed to complete the FY24 Grantee Survey, which is due in OLDC on January 31st, 2025. The purpose of today's webinar are to review key requirements for completing the Grantee Survey, to review the data you need to successfully complete the report, and to explain the process for submitting the report in the OLDC system. The audience for today's webinar is state LIHEAP coordinators and fiscal staff that assist with completing the Grantee Survey. If you have staff unable to attend or you want to hear the training again, a recording will be available on the ACF YouTube channel. We greatly appreciate you joining us today and hope today's training is valuable. With that, Melissa, please take it away.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Today's webinar is going to be 60 minutes long, and you can find handouts now in the sidebar of the GoToWebinar. This includes slides, a spreadsheet template, and other resources. As Megan mentioned, this webinar is being recorded and will be published on the ACF YouTube channel. Next slide, please. So if you have questions throughout the webinar, we encourage you to type them into the question box as we go. And once again, these are on the sidebar of the GoToWebinar. And if you can't see that, there should be a little orange arrow you can click that will expand it. When you submit your questions, we'll go ahead and review them, and we'll try to respond to them at the end of the webinar. And if we don't have time to get to your question, we will respond directly to you via an email. This is a table of contents or an index for this slide deck. Where the material we're going through can be dense, particularly if you're new to this, and many of you will want to go through it again or even hand this off to another staff person to review. And so this just kind of serves as a nice table of contents that hits on the key things that we're going to be discussing today. Next slide. Dan, I'm going to go ahead and present this, if that's all right. This is a report schedule. This is a really nice thing, by the way, to print out and keep on your wall or near your desk. It highlights all of the due dates for all of the reports that are upcoming, as well as the ones that have recently passed. This that we're talking about today is Module 1 of the Performance Data Form, the Grantee Survey, and it will be due on the 31st of January in 2025. And the focus of this report, as we'll talk about, are the sources and the uses of funds, average benefits, and maximum income cutoffs. And this plays along with all of the other reports you see on this list to tell a full story of the LIHEAP program. So we're going to start with a poll like we normally do. How prepared do you think your team is for completing the FY 2024 Grantee Survey? We're going to pull it up here in a second, but are you not at all prepared? You haven't turned attention to this at all? Are you a little prepared? You're aware, but you haven't planned yet? Are you mostly prepared? You're already planning and starting to work out the nuances of this report? Or are you very prepared? You're already working on it, you understand it, and you're just attending this webinar to, to refresh and make sure you're clear on everything. Are you ready? All right. So we have a few people, or a handful, that are not at all prepared. Some, about a third of you are a little prepared. You're aware of this, but you haven't started planning yet. So this webinar is good timing for you. Many of you are mostly prepared, and so hopefully this will help you figure out the last of the information you need to kind of push forward. And for those of you who are very prepared, hopefully everything you hear today affirms the direction you're going or answers anything, any outstanding questions that you have. And so let's move forward. We'll give Jeb a chance to get to the next slide. Perfect. I'm going to hand it over to Dan Bausch.
Thanks, Melissa. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We want to start with an overview of the Grantee Survey and how that fits into the overall reporting picture for reporting information on your LIHEAP program to HHS. The Grantee Survey is the name of a historic LIHEAP report, but it's not a standalone report. Going back to 2016, around 2016, it's been included in a larger report called the LIHEAP Performance Data Form. The Performance Data Form has 3 different modules. Today's webinar is on Module 1. We're going to be doing an additional webinar on Module 2 coming up in December that we'll tell you about at the end of this webinar. But the important thing is this is one report, but the Grantee Survey is asking for different kinds of information that often require input from your fiscal team. And the performance measures that's reported in Module 2 and also in optional Module 3 is different data that comes from your program as well as your energy vendors. So it helps to get a picture since you all aren't working in these reports every day, but once a year you're turning your attention to them. This is the report we're talking about. This is the Module 1, the Grantee Survey. It's asking for, in this section shown on the screen, it's asking for information about sources of LIHEAP funding in dollar amounts from your awards and carryover funds. This is a spreadsheet version, but it looks similar to this in OLDC. Module 2 on the next, actually here's section 4, which is the estimated uses of funds. And this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time on today's webinar, is looking at what this section is asking and how to complete it. We wanted to show you quickly Module 2. This is the performance measures module that we'll be providing training on in December. Also a spreadsheet view of it, but you can see it looks different from Module 1. And lastly, this is optional Module 3. This is not required, but several of you fill this out each year with additional information that's useful to track on impacts of your LIHEAP program and the assistance you provide. Okay, so the Grantee Survey Module 1 is a very important report that's been collected for several decades. It's focusing on how the funds that were available in a federal fiscal year were obligated or designated. Very important. This is not an audit report in the sense that this is not something where you're accounting for how every dollar was expended. This is a report that provides a snapshot of how you obligated LIHEAP funds, the average benefits for different types of assistance, and your income eligibility criteria. As I mentioned earlier, there's 2 main sections in the Grantee Survey. There's a section on sources of funds, and then there's a section 4, on uses of funds. The 3 main types of data that have to be reported in the Grantee Survey are first the amount of funds obligated, and that's usually something that is contained in your fiscal records, where you may have to consult with your fiscal staff. The second type of data is average benefit amounts provided to households. That's different because that's not looking at obligations, but that's actually looking at the benefits you gave out during the prior federal fiscal year, in this case, FY24, looking at all those benefit amounts for each assistance type and calculating the mean or the average to be able to report this. The last piece of information is for a 4-person household, what the maximum income cutoff limit was based on your income eligibility criteria. So if you use 150% of the poverty guidelines, you would report what 150% is in a dollar form for a 4-person household. Same thing if you're using 60% of state median income or any other threshold. So where does this data go when you complete this report? You complete it in the OLDC system, but it's ultimately compiled, taken, and used and published. First, it's published in the annual LIHEAP report to Congress. Those are available on the ACF LIHEAP website and on the performance management website. The information is taken and published in the LIHEAP data warehouse, so you can go and access it for your state, other states, all states, going back historically to 2001. It's used to answer questions about how much LIHEAP funds are going to different purposes, different program components, what the average benefits are, what the income cutoffs are. And it's, of course, useful for you to take this information to track your program over time and to compare what you're doing to other states, especially if you're considering program changes in the future. Here's a highlight from how the data was used from your 2023 grantee surveys. So all state grant recipients provided an estimated $3.031 billion for heating assistance in FY23. 23 states provided cooling assistance, $566 million, and 49 states provided FY23 funds for crisis assistance to use prior year funds. So this is really useful information to give the overall national picture of how LIHEAP funds are being utilized to help low-income households. Okay, so now we're going to turn to the 2024 report and talk about what's new and what should be on your radar for completing the report by January. So first, there has not yet been an action transmittal published for the report, but this is coming soon. It'll be released in the near future, and the report is not yet open in the online data collection system, the OLDC system. When the action transmittal is published, the report will be made available in the OLDC system. The instructions that were published with last year's AT are still correct and can still be used as you're preparing for this report. So we encourage you, if you are looking for those instructions, I think we included them as in the handouts here. We're happy to also email those to you if you need them. But we want to encourage you that this action transmittal is coming soon. And if you need more information or you need something to get the resources from your state to start working on the report, you can contact your program specialist for confirmation. But the action transmittal from the past several years, you can see that the report's been due each year, and this will be coming soon. The due date is January 31st, 2024, so a little over 2 months away. And the report will need to be submitted in the OLDC system as it was last year for 2023. And so to do that, you'll need to have the correct designated official who's able to certify and validate and submit the report. So good news is there's no changes to the report from last year's 2023 report. So there have not been any additions to the report. There have not been any changes to the layout or the information that's requested. The report should look exactly the same to you, and we encourage you to look back at the instructions from last year, but also to look at any emails you received with questions about your 2023 grantee survey, so you can see what issues came up last year and be prepared for them this year to make sure your report addresses any of those items prior to submission. For 2024, one important item for this report is the funding sources and what you're asked to report by when you report on the uses of those funding sources. So 2024 for the grantee survey, there's two buckets that you're asked to report under, or two categories. The first is your 2024 what are called non-supplemental funds. Those are your block grant funds, your reallotment funds that were provided at late at the end of 2024, and any prior year award funds that were carried over are going to fall into reporting on this bucket. There's two grant numbers here, two cans that are included here, so this slide may be useful for the fiscal folks. The second bucket is funds that you're awarded from the Infrastructure Act, and those are the LIHEAP funds under CAN G992605. So in this report, you're going to be asked to report on how you obligated those funds to different components. So instead of total funds for heating assistance, for example, you'd have to report total obligation of the non-supplemental funds for heating assistance, total obligation of the Infrastructure Act funds for heating assistance. There's an example on the bottom of this slide. If in your financial reports you obligated $500,000 to heating assistance, you would have to break out to confirm the amount by different types. Next slide. All right. For getting prepared for the report, we have a couple resources we've included for you in the handouts in addition to these slides and the instructions. One that we hope is really helpful for you is this check before you submit document. We've had this available for a few years. I believe we updated it last year, and it's really useful to just go through this checklist to verify your report's ready to go before you spend the time going through and certifying and submitting it in OLDC. I talked about the prior year instructions, but there's also been a lot of recent guidance that has been published by OCS in the form of information memorandums on topics relevant for the grantee survey. So one of the handouts attached here, and you'll also find on the ACF LIHEAP website, is this memorandum on obligations, expenditures, and refunds. So we encourage you, if you're having trouble kind of getting the numbers to align or understanding if you should be reporting an expenditure or an obligation and what counts as each, we encourage you to look at that guidance to kind of start the process. All right, now we're going to turn to key reporting points for section 3, and this is the sources of funds. I think it's back to you, Melissa.
Thanks, Dan. So as Dan mentioned, there are two kind of big pieces to this report. And for any of you who still or ever balanced a checkbook, you know that you track the money that is coming in to the checkbook, as well as, or the month, as well as the money that is going out. And that's kind of what we're looking at here in terms of obligations. what funding is coming into FY24 to obligate, and that's the sources section. And then the next section, uses, is how did you obligate those funds, and the two should balance. So let's start by looking at the sources. What we're looking for in this section is all federal LIHEAP funds available for obligation during FY24, and this includes funds awarded by HHS, as well as funds that may have been awarded by HHS in FY23, but that you carried over as unobligated into 24. So we're talking about all the funds that you now have available to obligate in FY24. Now, HHS has pre-populated this section for you with values from their records. And so this includes the awards that they've given you, as well as the information that you reported on carryover funds. But it's really very important for you to check that these pre-populated values are correct. I will always remember the Oklahoma grant recipient, and the coordinator there checked hers very carefully and found an error, and everyone had to go back and redo their reports because it turned out everyone's pre-populated amounts had errors in them. And so do yourself a huge favor, double check that those amounts are right, and not just the amounts that HHS has awarded, but also making sure that the carryover amounts that you originally reported are still accurate. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. If there are issues with the pre-populated values that you can't correct yourself because they're blocked or grayed out, please contact your program specialist. Now let's go over to uses, and this is where, as Dan mentioned, we're going to spend the bulk of our time. And this is the section where we're talking about how all that money that was available for you to obligate got obligated. How did you break it out? Where did you put that funding in different areas? And so let's take a look at this. The first is that the main fiscal data you're going to need are obligation amounts, and these are estimated uses of funds. That's what the section is called. And we're going to look here at columns, and you're going to notice this report that the columns are all bunched together. And I'm going to reiterate this several times, but each column is a separate reporting point. It comes from a different part of your system likely. So we have a lot of grant recipients who try to reconcile all of these numbers because it looks like they should be on this form, but in reality you should be treating each column separately. It's a different piece of information, and we'll walk through that. Next slide. So as Dan was saying, we're talking about obligations in this first column, not expenditures. And the LIHEAP statute gives you all a great deal of flexibility to define what obligation means. Now, for some of you, obligations and expenditures are the same thing, but for many of you, it's not. So expenditures usually include benefits that are issued or paid, vendors that are paid, contracts that are paid. But in some cases, obligated funds aren't actually expended until after the end of the fiscal year. So you may obligate funds to, say, a sub-grant recipient or a contract that may not get spent until future fiscal years. And so we're looking at that obligation in this form. We're not looking at when it's spent. We're looking at when it's obligated. That's what this column is all about. Examples of obligations, if you want to go on back, examples of obligations may include, but may not, you need to look at your own definition, approval letters issued to clients, credit lines or contracts established with vendors, purchase orders, and even sub-grant recipient or other contracts that tell them how much they will be allocated. Those can even be obligations in some states, tribes, and territories. Next. The second column, as I mentioned, is different than the first because in this column you actually are looking at expenditures, and this is where a lot of people get tripped up because they're trying to make this average household benefit somehow align with those obligations in column 1. But in many of for many of you, these two will not talk to each other. Your obligation amounts are completely different from the amount that you expended, because you may be expending obligations from prior years, for example. This second column is the average dollar benefit amount that recipients received during FY24. So this is all about expenditures. If you want to go to the next slide, we actually give a little calculation of how to calculate an average benefit, but you're going to need to go into your system and use your program data and identify the benefit amounts each household received, and then calculate the average value. So for example, we have 3 households here. You add up their benefits and you divide it by 3. And so that's going to give you an average benefit. Once again, these are expenditures. These are the amounts of money that people actually were given as benefits. And so this may not align with the number you have in that first column, which is how you obligated funds to certain components. If you can't calculate this, these amounts for some reason, then you need to provide an estimate based on the funds that you used and the households served, and you need to leave a note that the average benefits are not directly calculated. If you have any questions about this, please reach out and give us a call. We've helped states, tribes, and territories through this before, and we're glad to talk you through and help you figure out how to best calculate your average benefits. And the third column, this is probably the easiest, or should be for all of you, is to report the cutoff annual dollar income for a 4-person household. And it should be based on your income eligibility criteria you used during FY24. And so if you go to the next slide, the easiest way to say this is many of you have a matrix, for example, where you look at income cutoffs. And if you do, then you go to the family of 4, this household size 4, and you plop that number in there. The statute allows grant recipients to set income eligibility cutoffs at different levels. So some of you are using federal poverty guidelines, some of you are using state median, some of you are using both. It's up to you to determine that. In the grantee survey, we just want to know what that is. We want to make sure that you are sticking with what you said you were going to do in your model plan, and that it's in compliance with the statute. And so you should use the criteria in effect at the beginning of FY 2024. You can also include a note if you updated to use criteria that was available later in a fiscal year. So for example, some of you actually change your income eligibility criteria mid-year for, say, a cooling program. And so if you decide to use those numbers in the grantee survey, please indicate that in a note so that we can understand that you changed that number midway through the year. We've included links here to the federal poverty guidelines and the state median income estimates so that you can go in and reference those if needed. And I think on the next slide, we've given you an actual kind of example for crisis assistance. Your maximum income criteria for FY24 was 150% of federal poverty guidelines. We want to confirm the dollar amount you used in the grantee survey. And so the best and easiest way to do that is go right to your program records. If you have a chart you use for households, that's the easiest way to pull it. But you can use the federal poverty guidelines and the links we've given you to verify that that's accurate. Carryover funds are a big area that we see. We end up providing a lot of training and technical assistance on for this particular report. These are the funds that grant recipients don't obligate during the same year they're given. So if you decide that many of you will hold on to 5 to 10% of funds and not obligate them anywhere and carry them into the following year, some of you do it for startup, some of you use it for other purposes. But the idea is that they're not obligated. Remember, we're not talking about expended now. We're saying that these funds are not things that you tied up in a contract, they're just hanging out there. And in the grantee survey, there's really 2 places that we address these kinds of funds. in the first section, we talked about the sources. We're talking about those carry over unobligated funds that you brought in to the year. So in from FY23 into FY24. And then we're also in the uses of funds talking about those unobligated funds that you are carrying out of 2024 and into 2025. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, and you need to understand that the amount you report is being carried over should match those amounts in your FY 2024 carryover and reallotment report that's due in December. So this one's due in January, which means you shouldn't have issues matching it. But if you do, please reach out to us, because this is a major tripping point for a lot of folks. It's tricky, it can be tough to get your head around, but the idea is that all of these reports should really be able to be reconciled with one another, and the carryover is one place that you're going to see, or one thing you're going to see that's in multiple reports. And so we really are here to help you get your head around it. But understand that it's a big piece of this report. It's in both the sources and uses section, and it's kind of an area that's easy to get to stumble over, and so we're here to help with that. Here's a really useful chart, and it includes carryover rules, sources, and uses, and just talks about kind of how this flows in the report for both non-supplemental, these are your regular funds, for lack of a better way to say it, as well as your IIJA funds. And the general rule is that up to 10% of funds can be carried over to the next fiscal year as unobligated. Now, we always advise that you carry over a little less to give yourself room for things like refunds, but the general rule is 10% can be unobligated and carried into the following year. In the report, the carryover is in both the sources and uses area, and that's what these two other columns are for. And it talks about that if you carried funds into 2024, they're going to be found in the sources section along with all the awards from HHS. And then if you decided to take some unobligated funds out of 2024 and carry them into 25, it should be reflected in the uses section. And so Dan's going to give some examples later where he shows you specific lines, but just keep in mind that this is a useful chart for showing you how those are broken out in this report. This is the biggie, and there should be consistency between sources and uses. So for those of you who did learn to balance a checkbook, you know that what's coming in, you should be able to see also what's going out, and they should match. And so that's really what this report is about, where you have the sources, all of the funds coming in to 2024, and in the next section, you're going to want to see how each of those funds were obligated, not expended, obligated, and the two should match. The only instance where they shouldn't match is if you're sending money back to HHS. So for each funding type, the total funding amounts in Section 3, sources of funds, should match the total amounts in Section 4, uses of funds. And specifically, we've put lines here that should match. So line 10 in Section 3 should match line 14 in Section 4. And the sum of lines 12 and 13 in Section 3 should match line 47, and those are for IIJA funds in both sources and uses sections. So for example, you were awarded $50 million of regular LIHEAP block grants for FY 2024. You also had $5 million in FY 23 funds that you carried over to obligate in 2024. So you have $55 million of funds available to obligate. In the next section, you're going to report how you did that. So 20 million went to heating, or was obligated to heating assistance. 10 million was obligated to cooling. 5 million was obligated to year-round crisis. $15 million was obligated to weatherization, and $5 million was obligated to administration and planning. In this case, you did not carry over any into the next year. So you obligated it all to different resources. And what you see here is $55 million, which matches up with the $55 million that we saw in the sources section. The final is consistency with household report. In general, the uses of funds, which is what we just saw on the last screen, should be consistent with the types of assistance reported in your household report. So we understand that there are different rules for obligations versus expenditures, and so you may have some assistance types that you report in your grantee survey as obligated, but maybe you didn't spend those in the same year, and so we may not see them in your household report. But in general, if you are obligating large amounts of money to heating and cooling, we expect to see heating and cooling in your household report as well. So what we expect you to be able to report, as we've said multiple times, are the total awards or funds, the average household benefit, and maximum dollar amount in income for the funds that you were awarded. But we are going to be, remember, this tells a LIHEAP story, all of your reports together. And so if there are funds that you obligated, but say you didn't actually expend, and so we're not going to see anything in your household report, we want you to add a note. So if you obligated $0 for a type of assistance, but we see a big amount of money or a big amount of households served because you're spending perhaps past year's money, we'd want to see a note. Or vice versa, you obligated a large amount of money to cooling, but you're waiting to spend it until next year or until this year, FY25, so we're not going to see anything in the household report. Any type of those kinds of anomalies or stories, please leave a note just so that we can say, gosh, you know, it says you put a lot of money towards cooling, but we see no cooling households in your household report. And a note that says, oh, we're waiting to spend that until FY25 would explain that for us. And as I just said, and you'll hear many times, please feel free to include notes. There's a notes section for a reason. It helps us to understand the reported data, and in some cases we even use those notes to explain and provide context in the report to Congress. They're reviewed and they provide us useful context. They may prevent or keep us from having to call you, for example, to ask you follow-up questions. Some examples are things that I just went over. You know, a large amount of funds were obligated to a category like cooling, but no households were served with that assistance, so we don't see that in the household report. Or if your carryover amounts don't match your 2024 carryover and reallotment report, that's another common one. Please leave a note and explain to us why. Each funding section contains 2 questions you're required to answer. The first is, are there any funds that were obligated in the current fiscal year but will be used to serve households in the subsequent fiscal year? This is very common for some of you, so you'll just want to answer yes or no to that. Are average household benefits estimated due to unique program operation rather than directly calculated? So some of you may provide program delivery or have program delivery costs that are included in your average benefits, but they're not a direct benefit to the client. And so if you're doing any kinds of those estimated calculations, we want you to click yes and include a note to explain it here. I'm not going to read through this this chart because we're getting short on time, but I want you all to see that this is a useful piece of kind of document that you can keep next to you as you're doing this report. It really explains how different pieces of data, both fiscal and program data, as well as program information like maximum benefit amount, are kind of pulled together to put together this report. And so I'd encourage you to take a look at it. It's a nice summary of the pieces of information you're going to need and how it's all recorded in order to complete and submit this report. And with that, I am now going to turn it over to Dan. Thanks.
All right, thanks. Now we're going to look at the steps to submit the report. The report's due at the end of January, so it's important to be thinking about what you may need to get the report done and pull the different pieces of information. One item that many of you will need is to coordinate with fiscal staff about the obligation information and the sources of funds. This is an example of a schedule. This isn't something you have to do or is expected of you, but it's an example of what you might put together to be able to meet the due date. Usually there has to be a coordination with fiscal staff, making sure that they can give you the information by a set date. But you may also need to talk to your IT team or your contractor about getting the benefit information for each household, so you can calculate the average benefit information. OLDC also has its challenges with being able to get in and enter the information. So we recommend that before the end of January, you verify you can get into OLDC, find the report, and just be able to work in it. So you're not kind of scrambling on January 31st trying to get it entered and submitted. So with OLDC and confirming access, you have to go through Grant Solutions. If you aren't familiar with this, you're a newer coordinator, newer to the LIHEAP program, we highly recommend you contact your program specialist. Our team at Apprise can help with navigating an OLDC, finding your information, sending you older reports. We can't provide you with the access to OLDC. There is a help desk that Grant Solutions has to deal with access issues. So you'll see that at the end of the slides. This is the information for how you will find the report in OLDC. You navigate to the program, your name, the report's listed as the Performance Data Form. And one important piece is that the Grantee Survey is Module 1 of that form. So the same time you're filling out Module 1 that we've been talking about today, Module 2 is also due at the same time as part of this report. So it's a lot to fill in all at once. So we recommend kind of planning ahead and trying to work on it in stages. We have sent emails after our review for 2023, and those usually ask a few questions if we found anything where the notes weren't clear, or we found any items that we thought might need a second look. We send those to each coordinator. So we recommend that you locate those emails, you look through them before submitting, as I mentioned earlier. If you need help or you're new to the program, contact us and we can also help you locate those. All right, now we're going to look at some examples. And for the PowerPoint, we've tried to make them easy to see and easier to understand. So you're not going to see the big spreadsheet version that we showed earlier. But we're going to look at a couple examples focused on the funds that were awarded or available, and then how those funds were obligated. Okay, and one other reminder is as we get toward the end of the webinar, if you have questions, just go ahead and submit them into the question box for GoToWebinar on the side of your screen. Okay, first example we're going to look at is grant recipient X, and they had regular funds and decided to save their Infrastructure Act funds. So in the red here, you'll see for 2024, this made up grant recipient got 25 million in regular funds. That's the non-supplemental funds. That's bucket number 1 in the report. And they got 5 million in the Supplemental Infrastructure Act funds. So that's a total of 30 million. So in section 3, that's the sources of funds. This information gets pre-populated for you to help make the report easier. So in that section, there'll be a line that says regular block grant funds, Infrastructure Act award, and so forth. So we would see 25 million for the regular funds, 5 million for the Infrastructure Act funds, and section 3 is going to then add up to 30 million. The decisions, what do they do with the funds? Well, they obligated all of their regular funds to assist households and decided not to carry over any of that to 2025. That means in section 4, for their regular funds, all 25 million would be split across, depending on how they obligated it to heating and crisis, weatherization, and so forth. On the unobligated carryover line, they would have $0. Now, what did they do with the Infrastructure Act funds? Let's pretend they decided to obligate most of it, 98%, and carry over just 2% to 2025. So if we take 5 million and calculate 98%, that's 4.9 million. They would be putting on the lines for assistance and administration and other items they may have obligated it for. And the small 2% of funds that they carried over, 0.1 million, gets put on the Infrastructure Act carryover line toward the bottom of the report. Now the important check is, does section 3 match section 4? Are you accounting for all the dollars that were available to be obligated? And in this case, we are, because we have 30 million in sources and 30 million in uses. Now they didn't obligate all 30 million, but the report still shows they obligated 29.9 million, carried over just a small amount. We've got a second example here. This is grant recipient Y, and we're going to pretend that they use some of their regular and some of their Infrastructure Act funds. So in 2024, they were awarded 30 million in the regular non-supplemental funds and 7 million in the Infrastructure Act funds. So in section 3 under sources, it'd be 30 on the regular block grant line and 7 for the infrastructure award. Now we'll look at the decisions that they made for obligating those funds. For regular funds, they obligated 90%, and they decided to carry over the maximum overall. The maximum overall allowed is 10%, and they kind of mirrored that with their regular funds. So in section 4, we're going to put 90% of the 30 million is 27 million across their different assistance types, and they carried over 10%. That was unobligated, hasn't been designated for use during 2024, and that 3 million amount gets put on the carryover to 2025 line. Infrastructure funds, this example state decided to obligate all their Infrastructure Act funds in 2024. So that means all 7 million are going to get put on the different assistance lines or the administration line or the Assurance 16 line, depending on how they obligated those funds. And then 0 gets put on the carryover line. So just like the prior example, we see section 3 adds up to 30 plus 7 is 37 million. And section 4, when you add it all up, also adds up to 37 million. Now these are just 2 examples. There are circumstances where maybe there's a small amount you had to return, you couldn't obligate, or you carried funds into 2020, 4, and those would count under a source in section 3. These are, but the same principles you see in these examples apply, and we're happy to answer questions if you are trying to figure out why are my uses or my sources adding up to one number, and why are my uses not matching to that number. All right, now we're going to go to final reminders and then take your questions. So I'll turn it to Melissa.
So the material we went through is pretty dense today, and we understand there may still be questions, and as you go, you may come up with more questions. And so these are intended to give you some of the resources that you need to reach out and receive assistance. Just a reminder, the report is due on January 31st, 2025, and so you should be planning in order to complete by that date. It'll be submitted in an OLDC. Keep in mind the Grantee Survey is not an audit report. If I had to give you one piece of advice from my time as a director, as well as working with others, it's that this is not one of those reports you should be balancing to the penny. This is about using the information you have to show where you put or designated certain funds. And if you find yourself really stressing out or kind of just not able to get those numbers to reconcile, please reach out. Do not spend a lot of time spinning. This is something we can help with, and it should be a fairly straightforward report for you to complete. Next slide, please. There are no changes from last year's report, so that's good news for many of you. It has the same layout, lines, and requirements, and if you look back into your emails from Apprise, you'll be able to find where maybe you stumbled or tripped up last year, or where we had additional questions, and that might help you to look forward or anticipate any questions we might have this year as well. As with last year, you're going to report on those two categories of funds, the regular, non-supplemental, as well as IIJA funds. Next slide. Remember that you're going to have to file this in OLDC, and that can be a time-consuming process if you're not regularly visiting OLDC or not logged in, or you don't have your credentials. And so make sure you leave some time for that. We've left you the login information here, as well as kind of some navigation assistance, and we've also put in the help desk line. Now, if you're not getting a response, or if you're in OLDC and just need help navigating, absolutely give us a call and we'll be able to help you. This is the submission process. Now, hopefully by the time you get ready to submit this report, you've already done the household report and you'll be an ACE expert. But just to remind you, you will need to take steps to do this, and this includes entering and saving your report, validating it, certifying it, and submitting it. And you need to have certain roles to take all of these steps. So make sure that whoever's entering the report has the correct credentials so that they don't have to log out and find the right person to get this done. If you'll recall, this is true for the household report as well, but we do have several validation checks programmed into OLDC. We have both warning messages, and these are data that might be correct, but that we want you to double check. If for some reason you get a warning message and you say, no, this is absolutely the right information, that should trigger you to leave a note, because it means that there's some kind of discrepancy, maybe compared with last year's numbers, or it looks a little funny. Apprise will probably follow up with you unless they see a note that explains it. So if you get a warning message, use that as an indicator to leave a note about that data. Fatal error messages are totally different. These are things that are inconsistent or arithmetically impossible, and you won't be able to move on until you fix it. If you get either a warning or an error message and you're just unclear about what it means, or you're unable to resolve it, reach out to us and we'll help you work through that. Remember that once you submit your report, Apprise will email you to ask questions or alert you to any issues, and you should respond directly to Apprise as promptly as possible. Once Apprise confirms the data is correct and complete, your liaison will accept it in OLDC. If you later identify that something is needed to change or you have a revision, you can do so in OLDC. Next slide. We have a bunch of resources here. Many we referenced during the webinar, so I'll leave that there. Next. We have upcoming webinars. December 10th, we'll be completing the Performance Data Form Module 2. These are the data that you will be collecting from both your system and from energy vendors, as well as completing quarterly reports. That'll be on December 17th. We said this in our last webinar. It's worth repeating. Module 2 of this report, the Performance Data Form, requires you to get information from your energy vendors. That's outlined here on this slide, but we just want to remind you all that if you're not already working on this, you probably should be. And if you need assistance, please reach out. We can give you resources as well as walk you through one-on-one the steps you should be taking to get this information. And we're going to ask a poll to wrap up the webinar. How helpful was this webinar in understanding what is needed to complete the FY24 Grantee Survey? Was it not at all helpful, not too helpful, somewhat helpful, or very helpful?
We'll give you a little bit of time to answer this, and we're going to start answering the questions. We have a couple that have come in. I'll give you about 5 more seconds if you can answer the poll, please. All right, you can bring it up, Jeb. Okay, good. Well, we see that it appears that it was helpful for most of you. If it wasn't helpful or you have suggestions for next time, if you would email us and let us know. We are always trying to make these as useful as possible. All right, so we do have some questions. So just since we're finishing up here, I want to make sure we can get to the questions. The first is when do you think the grantee survey with the pre-populated information will be available? So right now, the federal LIHEAP staff are working to get it approved so that it can be released in OLDC. That's where it has to be submitted. So they're working on getting that done so that it can be available soon. If you're trying to work on the report and you want to know what your values will be in Section 3, if that would be helpful for you, we're happy to also work with you to send you that information. So you know it's your total 2024 awards and what you reported as being carried over to 2024 in last year's report. So we're happy to help you with that. And the spreadsheet template is attached here if you're looking for what the template looks like. There's another question about OLDC and does it have API capabilities to kind of pull the data in instead of typing it in? It does not have that capability. With OLDC, it's definitely, yes, there's a number of fields you have to type in and enter. And there is always the possibility of typos. So we ask people to look at it very carefully as you're going about entering it, double check it. There are these built-in checks in OLDC that try to alert you if there might be a problem, like sources not equaling to uses. And then when Apprise reviews it, we're also checking for things like unusually high numbers or low numbers. But ultimately, it can't pull in a spreadsheet or pull in any information at this time. Let's see. I think one more question was about clarifying about obligations and expenditures. The challenge there, I think, as Melissa, as you alluded to, is it does vary from state to state, and it depends on your state's definitions for what counts as an obligation. we have some examples in the slides, but ultimately you have to look at your state's definitions and maybe some of the past communications you've had about that with us, with OCS. The important thing is to make sure you understand what counts as an obligation for your state and that you're reporting consistently in this report. Anything to add on that, Melissa? I think that'll be our last question today.
I don't have anything to add. Just reach out if you have unanswered questions. We're happy to tackle them one-on-one with you.
Okay, well, we thank you all for your time. Here's some final emails and information if you want to take a screenshot or get that from the slides attached here. Appreciate your time and hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep, thank you. Bye-bye.